Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and not since they were burning broads at the stake has a lady been as ruthlessly scorned by the public as Ronda Rousey was following her decapitation 13 months ago. Every public appearance or soundbite in the build-up to 207 has been either molten hot with murderous intent or brimful of an uncharacteristic vulnerability that's actually been kind of endearing. One of the only long interviews Ronda has done recently was when she returned to The Ellen Show. She seemed very relaxed and understated, and actually kind of funny and charming. Now, when you consider the absolute car crash of emotion that was her first appearance on Ellen, it was good to see her in higher spirits. I mean, we're only talking about a sport here. Love her or hate her, nobody wants to see a young lady on TV sobbing about suicide. On Conan, she stated that she doesn't feel the need to trash talk anymore, which is a sign of a lesson learned. Sometimes a loss can humble a fighter, and these most recent interviews were both humble and likable. But there have also been some moments where we've seen the fury, evidence that we're dealing with the same old Ronda. Her face-off with Amanda was a perfect example. She tried to stare Amanda into an early grave, and when it came time to talk to the crowd, she just stormed off. Dana later stated that this was actually a production error. They weren't supposed to talk to Ronda. If that is the case, I'd imagine someone on the UFC's production team is currently on life support, because Ronda looked fucking murderous. Joey Diaz recently commented that he had heard Ronda is absolutely furious with Joe Rogan and anyone who said anything of a negative air since the Holly fight. Now, I'm not sure how reliable that information is, but if Joey's comments are accurate, then the fact that she could be furious with Rogan shows just how deeply wounded she must have been. I mean, if there was a ministry for propaganda with regards to Rousey, then Joe would have been the chief executive. Nobody was more over-the-top complimentary of Ronda than Joe Rogan. But I'll come back to that later. A big part of the narrative heading into this fight from Ronda's perspective appears to be one of rage and revenge against everyone. Not even animals are safe. Rousey has always written little mantras on her hand wraps like retire undefeated. Well, for this camp she's got a new slogan, FTA, fuck 'em all. That's her new motto, fuck everybody. I can imagine Ronda's Christmas cards this year. To you and your family. I hope you die in a ditch. Go fuck yourselves. Lots of love, Ronda Rousey. A recent promo of the fight showed images of Ronda's gym, and on the wall was the affirmation, success is the best revenge. Then it plays a soundbite of Ronda where she says the following, it's real easy to feel like the whole world is picking on you and they hate your guts. But the hope that can't get crushed is what gets me up. The world has tried to crush it, but it's still there. That quote is a pretty good indication of her mindset. The world has tried to crush me. Well, you had your day. But success is the best revenge. So watch this, you motherfuckers. And to be honest, even though no one enjoyed Ronda's loss more than me, I love that picking yourself up, rising against the odds, it's me against the world type story. My only hope would be that she has asked herself the questions, why did they try to crush her? Otherwise, she may be doomed to relive that whole nightmare. Under the circumstances, a victory over Amanda will be amazing. 13 months ago, Holly Holm carved her up like a Christmas turkey and just decapitated her ass in front of millions of fans. In the days, weeks, and months following, it must have seemed like the entire world was popping open bottles of champagne and toasting images of her unconscious body. That sent her into a downward spiral of suicidal thoughts and depression, where she felt like the entire might of the internet was doing everything in its power to crush her spirit. Just over a year later, she's putting it all on the line again, risking a repeat of that whole fucking thing by stepping back into the octagon in a bid to recapture a crown. A victory would be an incredible comeback on several levels. On the 30th of December, she may salvage something big from what must have been one of the worst years of her entire fucking life. There's a lot on the line for Ronda Rousey. If that was the whole story, then I could understand anyone rooting for Ronda. Unfortunately, we all know there's another huge element to a comeback. Ronda's defeat was one of my most satisfying moments as a fan of MMA. Not because I hate Ronda, but because Holly's head kick served as a frontal lobotomy to an MMA media who had completely lost their fucking minds. I discussed this angle in a previous video, but I want to go into a little more detail here because this is very much the other side of Rousey's return. During her reign, Dana White characterized her as a cross between a religious deity and a female Chuck Norris, smashing up bars and beating the fuck out of rowdy groups of men on the weekends. Both Dana and Ronda could not keep Floyd Mayweather's name out of their mouths. Apparently, Ronda would ragdoll Floyd and hurt him badly. And this was a hypothetical fight that the retarded mainstream media bandied about for most of 2015. It must have been so frustrating for Floyd because there's really no way for the guy to respond. And every time Floyd versus Ronda came up, the internet was overflowing with comments like, "Floyd is a woman-beating piece of shit." The whole thing served as a constant source of publicity for a domestic abuse charge the guy was trying desperately to put behind him.
I wonder how Floyd feels being beat by a woman for once.
Ultimately, though, the incessant yapping about Mayweather added another epic dimension to Ronda's loss, because Floyd's comments on the fight were straight up fucking poetic. I don't think it's cool how everyone is trolling her on social media. Certain things you have to learn. People will love you on Friday, and then Sunday morning it's nothing but negative comments and people making jokes and people making fun about you, which I don't think is cool. I'm pretty sure she's a very, very strong person, but we still have to take into consideration that she has feelings. Everything happens for a reason. This was already written. Listen, if God says, in Floyd's career, I don't want to see him lose, you know what? I wasn't gonna lose. That doesn't mean that I haven't taken a loss before. I'm not talking about boxing. I'm just talking about life. When you lose a loved one, that's taking a loss. I think that everything is just a learning experience. In due time, she'll be able to bounce back and make some noise again in mixed martial arts. What a perfect response from Floyd. Who would have thought that one of the most heartfelt, sympathetic, and ultimately optimistic quotes on Ronda's loss would have come from a guy who was basically haunted by the specter of Ronda Rousey. Very classy, very cool, and basically a perfect, insightful summary of the whole situation. I'm a huge fan of Joe Rogan, and on the whole I consider him one of the most reasonable voices in MMA. But with regards to Ronda, the guy was always bizarrely all over the place. Joe seemed to oscillate between a teenager fawning over his first crush with way over-the-top flattery and a proud father holding his daughter for the first time, getting all choked up with emotion. Now, with regards to the latter, different fighters resonate with different people. And for whatever reason, Ronda's story struck a hugely sentimental chord with Joe. So I can't hate that. Joe's eating a ton of shit for getting emotional, but in a world where we often see media members move from one sport to another, like they're swapping Pokemon cards, it's actually great that the most prominent voice in MMA is so passionate about this sport that on occasion he's been moved to tears. I'm not going to criticize a man for that. Unfortunately though, to get to the whole point of this video, I do have to discuss the former. The completely over-the-top flattery. We all know what I'm talking about here. Comments like, Ronda's a mythical creature. She's a once-in-human-history type athlete. Her fights are historical events. Ronda Rousey lays Fabergé eggs. All of that over-the-top, out of touch with reality, gross hyperbole. Now, I've glossed over this in a previous video, but while Ronda was getting decimated in social media, Joe frequently characterized people reveling in her defeat as basically a bunch of pathetic, hateful losers. This was kind of frustrating coming from Joe because, for me, that type of gross hyperbole was a huge contributing factor to the backlash. A lot of people weren't solely reveling in Ronda's demise, they were reveling in the demise of, to quote Joe himself, the mythical creature that the media had created. In the aftermath of Ronda's loss, Rogan may not have quite returned to reality, but he was at least orbiting it. Max Kellerman did a great interview on whether or not Ronda was overrated. He was hugely complimentary of Ronda, stated that her accomplishments were amazing, and that as a fighter, she was not overrated. But with regards to people who had hyped her as the greatest female athlete on the planet, he felt that they clearly were overrating her. On one of his podcasts, Joe later referenced this interview, stating that Kellerman had basically nailed it. So at the time, Joe was starting to sound somewhat measured on the subject of Rousey. There are several other examples, but really, I'm not making this video to catch Rogan out, especially when you consider how much Joe talks. If the guy's awake for 16 hours a day, he must be talking for at least 15 of those hours. Commentating, doing stand-up, podcasts in his car, on the plane. I wouldn't be surprised if he starts doing podcasts in the fucking shower. The guy is incredibly prolific, so you are going to be able to find little gotcha contradictions in anyone who speaks that much. But to summarize the whole thing, for months on end we were relentlessly force-fed a completely inflated and distorted version of Ronda, until we were fit to burst. And when Ronda finally did lose, the whole thing exploded in her fucking face. Not only was she dealing with the backlash relating to her own actions, but she also had to bear the brunt of an avalanche of pent-up frustration towards all the media's bullshit, which was vicious. As I mentioned, in the immediate aftermath, commentators like Joe did appear to try to slide into a more reasonable position. But just this week, Joe posted a tweet, and rather than sounding like the voice of reason, he appears to be getting ready to double down on the madness. Somebody tweeted him his own quote about Ronda being a once-in-human-history type athlete, and his response was the following: "Name one other world-famous female ass-kicker before her that dominated everyone in front of her and became a massive global star. I'll wait." Now, Joe has obviously moved the goalposts to zero in on Rousey by suggesting he didn't just mean an athlete, he meant a fighter who was also a female and a global megastar. I mean, if he narrowed the parameters anymore, he would have just said, "Show me another athlete named Ronda Rousey who's dating Travis Brown. I'll wait." Anyway, my only point here was that if Ronda's appearances on Conan and Ellen suggested that she may have learned something from the whole thing, Joe's tweet is evidence that some of the loudest voices in the media probably didn't. They probably have no idea of their own role in all the hideous backlash. So if Ronda wins, it'll probably be business as usual. In this case, the business is a bunch of ridiculous, over-the-top hype that will only serve to set Rousey up for another big fall. They think they're on her side, but they're not doing her any favors. And for me, that whole media element is the other narrative heading into 207. Because more so than any other fight this year, UFC 207 represents a complete fork in the road with regards to 2017. MMA fans are facing two completely different realities, and both have pros and cons. If Ronda loses, then she very likely disappears from MMA, and MMA coverage continues to orbit reality in a somewhat reasonable manner. But MMA is starved of a star, and women's bantamweight likely continues to slide out of the limelight under a champion who the UFC don't seem to give a shit about. If Ronda wins, then she completes a comeback of epic proportions. She regains her crown, resuming life as one of the UFC's biggest stars. And the women's bantamweight division moves to the forefront of MMA. But we'll all likely have to endure an MMA media once again in the throes of delusional psychosis, which, as we all know, will be fucking insufferable. So even if you're not interested in Ronda, as an MMA fan, the outcome of this fight will probably have a bigger impact on the media you're consuming next year than any other fight in 2016. Because even if Conor lost, he wasn't going nowhere. I don't know if I'll be rooting for Ronda, but I respect the balls it takes to come back under these circumstances. And one thing's for sure, if she does fall short, I will not be celebrating her defeat this time. So, may the best broad win.